there does seem to be this opportunity. The White House does seem to be sufficiently afraid of the polling, not just with Arab Americans, but with the public as a whole, 66% of whom support a ceasefire. To want to try to mitigate somewhat, they put out this, Kamala Harris was the spokesperson for some effort to combat Islamophobia, which does seem to be rather pro forma. What does that mean? Who knows? But seems to be an effort to assuage the concerns of the Muslim community here in America. So they're feeling some kind of a pressure. At the same time, there has been reporting that the White House believes that we're still a year out from an election, and that by the time an election rolls around, what you described as happening, where people might say in polls in advance of an election that they might be willing to vote independent, by the time election day rolls around, they tend to fall back in line. The White House is basically banking on that. And I wonder, looking at that kind of reporting, assuming that that's what the White House is thinking, how does one get to a place where you're, from a place rather, where you're getting some lip service from Kamala Harris about how Islamophobia is bad, to a place where you can really put Biden in a position where where he might pick up that phone and do what so many of his predecessors have done when Israel was bombarding Palestine and say, you have to stop it?
Well, Biden's not capable of that. He has neither the moral fortitude or the presence to do it. It ain't going to happen. He's a complete product of the war industry, the Israel lobby. I mean, that they have funded his career as a politician. There's not going to be any sea change in Biden.
Do you think he's more captured than, because I've seen this reporting, right? Someone was posting around pages of a book that was recounting how when Reagan was in this position, there was another bombardment. And he said to his staff, gosh, Israel needs to cut this out. And one of his staffers said, well, maybe you should pick up the phone and call. He's like, is that going to work? He did it. And the bombardment stopped. There does seem to be a history, some precedent for America being able to flex its global power. The fact that Israel relies on American funding for its Iron Dome and for not really taking much in the way of damages from all of the bombardment that they get from Hamas, to use that as leverage to actually make them stop. They've gotten more than their pound of flesh, even if on an ideological basis you thought that kind of retribution was justified for the events of October 7th. So do you really think that Biden is more corrupt or more venal or more captured or more senile or more stupid? I mean, than people like George Bush and Barack Obama and Ronald Reagan?
No, you can't defy. I mean, remember, the problem is that with a powerful Israel lobby, Israel is an autonomous agent. So when Barack Obama was attempting to push through the Iran deal, Bibi Netanyahu was invited to speak before Congress and trash the entire deal. I lived in Israel. I covered that conflict for 7 years. And Washington has very little leverage over Israel. And remember that Congress is now preparing to appropriate $14 billion to Israel. And I don't understand why Israel, I mean, we're talking about a very, prosperous economy, technologically advanced, why they even need it. It's a kind of knee-jerk reaction in the face of that genocide is not over dramatic. They've cut off water and food, fuel. Babies are dying in incubators. I've been in the Jabalia refugee camp. So Gaza is one of the most densely populated spots on the planet, and Jabalia is the most densely populated spot in Gaza. And they're dropping massive bombs on the tops of refugee camps. And we heard all the, protestations on the part of Israel about not bombing the Anglican hospital. Well, now they're bombing one hospital after another, along with schools, mosques. So
churches, even church. I mean, we are in a place where I can't get past this, that a former Congress member's families are being killed by our quote unquote closest allies bombed. And still you only have so far one senator, and his name is not Bernie Sanders, but Dick Durbin, willing to call for a ceasefire.
I think a lot of people listening to people in power, President, you, Secretary Blinken, calling for a humanitarian pause, are asking themselves, why is that different from a ceasefire? 2 years ago, 2021, during an escalation of violence between Israel and Gaza, you called for a ceasefire and you said you, quote, couldn't disagree more with Netanyahu's policies, quote, when it came to the treatment of Palestinians. Is a ceasefire needed now?
I think it is, at least in the context of both sides agreeing. For example, the release of those who have been kidnapped should be part of this, immediate release. That should be the beginning of it. An effort should be made to engage in conversation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Let's face it, this has gone on for decades. Whatever the rationale from the beginning, it has now reached an intolerable level. We need to have a resolution in the Middle East that gives some promise for the future.
Have you told the president, the White House, you think it's time for a ceasefire? Because that is a word that the president is intentionally not using.
Well, believe me, what I said earlier about ceasefires under circumstances, for example, the release of those who have been kidnapped as part of it, indication that this is a good faith effort on the part of the other side. But no, I have not communicated with the White House on that.
Well, they heard you now.
Yeah, no, it's political cowardice, and really the bottom line is they don't want to pay the political price, and so we are aiding and abetting genocide. Remember, I was in Sarajevo during the war, a city also under siege. So I know what it feels like to be hit. But in Sarajevo, we were suffering about 300 to 400 shells a day, which resulted in about 4 to 5 dead a day and maybe 24 wounded a day. And it's still almost 30 years later. I still have nightmares about it. That's nothing. Nothing compared to what's happening in Gaza, where you have hundreds a day. I mean, 6,000 sorties. I mean, this is just to put it in scale. And although we lacked a lot in terms of food, we didn't have our water cut off. We didn't have our food cut off. I mean, this is really, truly a genocidal campaign to either kill, in the end, probably tens of thousands of Palestinians and to push the rest into refugee camps over the Rafah border into the Egyptian Sinai where they'll never return. That is clearly what Israel has embarked upon, and the United States, which knows, is a full partner in this. And is, they will do kind of public relations gimmicks, sending in 15 trucks or something. It's quite, for those of us who spent as much time as I have in Gaza, it's just beyond horrifying. It's and of course I'm sure I know of one woman who I knew who was dead. I'm sure there are many more. It's awful.
I'm so sorry to hear that. Yeah, the scale of it is really remarkable, and it is interesting to see now there's this jockeying over whether or not terms like genocide and ethnic cleansing are appropriate, despite the fact that there's a real growing consensus happening. I'm sure that you saw the head of one of the New York based UN agencies resigning with a letter that said, I'm very hesitant to throw the word genocide around, but I've been covering genocides around the world for, my entire career. And that is exactly what's happening here. And I'm sure that you also saw the reporting on the leaked intelligence document that I would love to get into a little bit if we can, which Israel confirmed as authentic, although they are trying to downplay it as not necessarily a plan that is going to be taken, which outlined 3 potential solutions or outcomes here for this conflict. It was drafted in the days after October 7th. And the plan is exactly what you described, calling for 10 cities to be established in the Sinai, followed by a humanitarian zone, quote unquote, that would allow egress of the 2.3 million Palestinians into that area, followed by newly constructed cities, telling people to evacuate northern Gaza, where there would be, quote, operations from the air that would allow a ground invasion in the area that is already evacuated. Phase 2 would be a gradual ground invasion of the territory in the north, which we know has already come to pass this week, apparently rather unsuccessfully, with a number of IDF soldiers being killed. And that the document even goes so far as to talk about how important it is to get international buy-in on this and to use advertising agencies to make it clear both to the world and to Palestinians that there's no going back here, that there are no opportunities to ever regain their land. I mean, when it's written out as obviously as that and that kind of a document, what else is there to really say?
Well, exactly. But, it's also most of the people in the Netanyahu government have been espousing this for their entire political career. They call it transfer. But we have members within the cabinet who've called for transfer not only of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, but the Israeli Arabs, the Israeli Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. That's been a very public call. And so this document, coupled with the political statements, of which there are innumerable, these are all very public pronouncements, I think it makes it very clear. And then people like myself, who spent many years reporting on the apartheid state of Israel, understand very well what the goal and the motive is. And that is what you saw, for instance, what you see in the West Bank is a kind of slow motion ethnic cleansing and seizure of land. It's what I reported on, in terms of creating Jewish settlements and closed military zones and ring roads. Essentially, what you've done is completely surround Palestinian villages and cities, and with the flick of a switch, you can cut it off. All of the tactics of, for instance, when Palestinians leave from the West Bank, leave the country, then they're refused entry to come back in. The house demolitions, the seizure of, the revoking of documents, in particular in East Jerusalem, because the Israelis want East Jerusalem, which is traditionally Palestinian, to become completely Jewish. And of course, that's also, that's done through architecture, seizing. I mean, East Jerusalem doesn't look anything like it did when I first went to East Jerusalem. They seize land and they build these fortress-like apartment buildings for Israeli settlers. But what happened on October 7th was essentially those attacks by Hamas gave Israel, or certainly those figures within the government and the security forces, gave them, in their minds, the justification to carry out the complete ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza. And I don't know what's going to happen in the West Bank. The vilest settler, the rampages by Jewish settlers, who, by the way, have just been issued automatic weapons by the IDF since October 7th, is completely out of control. So, and this could just go horribly wrong in so many ways, not only provoking Hezbollah, but provoking Iran. Remember, there's been airstrikes. Israel has carried out airstrikes, at least 2, on each of the airports in Syria, Aleppo, and Damascus, because Hezbollah is backed and armed by Iran, and that is the transfer point. The Hezbollah has missiles that can do significant damage to Israel. They're not like the small rockets that Hamas shoots off, which are highly inaccurate and deliver, have very little firepower. The lethality of those rockets is, minimal. But that's not true with Hezbollah. And I think the figure is 7,000. And things could go, I've covered war. And once you open that Pandora's box, it controls you. You don't control it. So we had a very ominous message from the foreign minister, the Iranian foreign minister out of Turkey. So, and Iran is not Iraq. I covered Iran. Iran is not Lebanon.
What do you mean by that in terms of their military power?
Yes, first of all, it's a very large country. I think what's the figure, 60 million or something. It's technologically very advanced. This could be, and the United States is, of course, seen as a co-conspirator in this genocide. And that's why the Biden administration has deployed naval task forces to the Persian Gulf. No, it's the Persian Gulf. It's not the Mediterranean. You deploy in the Persian Gulf to stop Iran. And we've had U.S. bases attacked in Syria and Iraq. No, it's a very, very dangerous game. And, it could go terribly, terribly wrong. And, the fact that we and the U.S. government or that the United States is blocking ceasefire resolutions, I mean, it's just almost beyond comprehension. We're vetoing ceasefire resolutions, and we are arming, giving more military aid to a campaign, to fund a campaign or equip an army that is carrying out an open act of genocide. You wonder where Samantha Power is. Didn't she write A Problem from Hell? So it's almost beyond belief. I mean, for those of us who come out of the region, and have been on the ground, it's I'm almost at a loss for words at how egregious the wholesale slaughter is, but also the utter idiocy of perpetuating this kind of genocide because of the regional consequences, which could be truly catastrophic.
I would like you to expound on that a little bit, because we are hearing some people who push back and say the left is being melodramatic. It's not going to be an escalation. It's not going to be World War III. People, I think, have a false confidence in America's ability to win a war. I don't know why they are so confident. We haven't won one in quite some time. And I think there's a false confidence in Israel's military capacity, and not distinguishing between their kind of troop capacity and their kind of technological capacity in terms of bombs and intelligence and the like. Miko Peled was on the show recently, and he was saying that is a big factor here, that everyone overestimates the power of the Israeli military. And I think also this question of, I think you alluded to this, how at risk all of this puts Jewish people around the world, Americans around the world, and everybody else who is seen as endorsing America's open endorsement of what Israel is doing. I keep thinking about and being chilled by the words from Osama bin Laden's manifesto after 9/11, where he literally writes, "As for the first question, why are we fighting and opposing you? The answer is very simple. 1, because you attacked and continue to attack us. 1A, you attacked us in Palestine. Palestine, which has sunk under military occupation for more than 80 years, and goes on to describe an occupation that I completely agree with, agree with his criticisms of, rather. So, what are the real risks here? Where do you see this going, and what off-ramps exist for us? What should people be calling for even beyond a ceasefire?
Well, ultimately, the two-state solution is dead, and the Israelis killed it by essentially seizing so much of the West Bank, so it's not viable.
Was it viable before then with the non-contiguous?
No, it probably wasn't, but it's not physically viable now. The Israelis never had any intention of creating a viable two-state solution, as we saw with the Oslo Agreement, which I was there for and covered, because Israel retained control of the borders. So they controlled what went in, what went out, and so that even Oslo wasn't viable.
That's so interesting, because so much of the pushback that you're getting from the mainstream is, to the extent that Palestinians don't have a state, it's because they were the ones that were being obstinate through the Oslo agreements. That they were the ones. Here was the map. Why wouldn't they just agree to this map?
Right. Well, that's why they wouldn't agree. So don't read Thomas Friedman. So that is the first point. And the second of all is Israel refused to acknowledge the right of return for Palestinians. So I worked in the West Bank. I mean, most of these crazy settlers are, transplants from Brooklyn. They weren't born in Israel. And, if you are Jewish and have no contact, no family, nothing, you can arrive in Tel Aviv and immediately get an Israeli passport. Whereas if your family is Palestinian and has lived in Palestine for generations, you can't get into the country. So, no, it was never. But now it's not even on the table in terms of discussion because Israel physically occupies so much of the West Bank. So the only solution is a secular state, one person, one vote. I'm not arguing that it's going to happen, but if you want to end the conflict, that's it.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you, and as always, keep the faith.